Chapter 12. The Dutch East India Company, 17th century CE, Trade, Ships, and Empire. The Dutch East India Company, known as the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, VOC, was founded in 1602 and rapidly became one of the most powerful and influential corporations in history. At its peak, the VOC dominated global trade, particularly in Asia and Africa, and played a central role in establishing Dutch colonial dominance. Using its superior maritime technology, the VOC revolutionized the nature of international trade, helped lay the foundations of European colonial empires, and exploited the natural resources of distant lands to enrich the Netherlands. The story of the VOC is a striking example of how technological superiority, particularly in shipbuilding, navigation, and warfare, can be leveraged to gain control over vast resources and exert influence over foreign lands and peoples. The VOC's ability to project power across the seas, establish monopolies on valuable goods like spices, and subdue local populations allowed it to build a vast empire that stretched from Southeast Asia to South Africa. However, this dominance came at the cost of severe exploitation, oppression, and the creation of long-lasting inequalities that are still felt today. In this chapter, we will explore how the VOC used its superior maritime technology to dominate global trade, the strategies it employed to control resources in Asia and Africa, and the broader consequences of its rise to power. The story of the VOC is not just one of economic success, but also a cautionary tale of how the exploitation of global resources can create enduring patterns of inequality. The foundation of the VOC, a maritime powerhouse. Land strapping. By the early 17th century, the Netherlands was a burgeoning economic power, thanks to its flourishing trade networks and mastery of maritime technology. Dutch shipbuilders had developed the Fluit, a versatile and efficient cargo ship that could carry large amounts of goods with minimal crew. The Fluit was cheaper to build and operate than other ships of the time, giving the Dutch a significant advantage in long-distance trade. This innovation, combined with advances in navigation and cartography, allowed Dutch ships to travel farther, faster, and more safely than those of their European competitors. The creation of the VOC marked a new chapter in Dutch maritime dominance. Established as a joint stock company, the VOC was granted a monopoly on all Dutch trade in Asia by the States General of the Netherlands. The company had the power to wage war, negotiate treaties, build fortresses, and establish colonies, making it a quasi-state entity with the backing of the Dutch government. This unprecedented level of authority allowed the VOC to operate with considerable autonomy, and it quickly set about expanding its influence in Asia. The primary goal of the VOC was to control the lucrative spice trade in the East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, which had long been dominated by the Portuguese and Spanish. Spices like nutmeg, cloves, and pepper were highly sought after in Europe, and the VOC sought to establish a monopoly on their production and distribution. The company's success in doing so would make it one of the most profitable enterprises in history, but it would also require the use of force, coercion, and exploitation. Superior ships and trade routes. Dutch dominance at sea. The VOC's success was built on its dominance of the seas. Dutch shipbuilders had perfected the art of constructing large ocean-going vessels that were both fast and durable, capable of carrying vast quantities of goods. The Fluit ship in particular was a game-changer. Unlike warships, which were heavily armed and expensive to operate, the Fluit was designed to maximize cargo space while keeping costs low. This allowed the Dutch to transport larger quantities of goods at a lower cost than their competitors, giving them a significant edge in the global trade market. In addition to the Fluit, the Dutch also developed highly advanced navigation techniques. Dutch cartographers, such as Willem Bleu, produced some of the most accurate maps of the time, which were used by VOC captains to navigate the treacherous waters of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. The Dutch also pioneered the use of the pendulum clock for determining longitude at sea, which allowed them to chart more precise courses and avoid dangerous shoals and reefs. The VOC established a network of trading posts and fortresses across Asia and Africa, which served as strategic bases for its operations. These outposts allowed the VOC to control key trade routes and project military power across vast distances. Among the most important of these were Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, on the island of Java, which served as the company's headquarters in Asia, and Cape Town at the southern tip of Africa, which was established as a resupply station for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. The Dutch were not content merely to trade with local rulers. They sought to dominate and control the production of valuable goods, particularly spices. To this end, the VOC used its superior ships and military technology to wage war on rival European powers, such as the Portuguese, as well as on indigenous kingdoms in the East Indies. By the mid-17th century, the VOC had established a near monopoly on the spice trade, controlling the production and distribution of nutmeg, cloves, and mace from the Spice Islands, the Moluccas in Indonesia. Exploitation and monopoly. The VOC's empire in Asia. The VOC's empire in Asia was built on a foundation of economic exploitation and military conquest. In its quest to control the spice trade, the company used both diplomacy and brute force to subdue local populations and establish monopolies on the production of valuable goods. In many cases, the VOC's actions had devastating consequences for the indigenous peoples of the region. One of the most infamous examples of VOC exploitation occurred in the Banda Islands, part of the Spice Islands, where the company sought to monopolize the production of nutmeg. The Banda Islands were the only place in the world where nutmeg was grown, and the VOC was determined to control this valuable commodity. When the local Bandanese refused to agree to the VOC's terms, the company launched a brutal military campaign to subjugate the islands. In 1621, under the leadership of Jan Pieterszoon Koen, the VOC massacred thousands of Bandanese and forcibly relocated the survivors to other islands. The company then repopulated the islands with slave labor and VOC settlers, ensuring that it had complete control over nutmeg production. The VOC's control over the spice trade allowed it to dictate terms to both producers and consumers. In Europe, the company maintained a monopoly on the importation of spices, driving up prices and reaping enormous profits. At the same time, the VOC imposed harsh conditions on local farmers and workers in Asia, often forcing them to produce goods for the company at artificially low prices. The exploitation of indigenous labor, combined with the use of slaves imported from Africa and other parts of Asia, was central to the VOC's business model. The company also played a key role in the Dutch colonization of parts of Southeast Asia. In Java, for example, the VOC established direct control over much of the island, using a combination of military force and alliances with local rulers to expand its influence. The company's presence in Java laid the groundwork for the later Dutch colonization of the entire Indonesian archipelago, a process that would continue into the 19th century. The VOC in Africa, Cape Colony and the slave trade. The VOC's reach extended beyond Asia to Africa, where it established one of its most important outposts at Cape Town in 1652. Situated at the southern tip of Africa, Cape Town was strategically located as a resupply station for Dutch ships traveling between Europe and Asia. The colony quickly became a vital part of the VOC's global network, providing fresh food and water for ships making the long journey across the Indian Ocean. Cape Town was initially intended as a small outpost, but it soon grew into a significant colonial settlement. The Dutch imported slave labor from Africa, India, and Southeast Asia to work on the farms that supplied the colony and passing ships. These slaves, along with indigenous Khoi peoples, were subjected to harsh conditions and brutal treatment by the Dutch colonists. Over time, the Dutch settlers expanded their control over the surrounding lands, displacing the Khoikhoi and other indigenous groups. The VOC also played a role in the early development of the transatlantic slave trade. While the company was primarily focused on trade in Asia, it occasionally transported slaves between Africa and the Americas, particularly to Dutch colonies in the Caribbean and South America. The company's involvement in the slave trade, though not as extensive as that of other European powers like the Portuguese and British, was nonetheless an important part of its operations, particularly in regions where labor was in high demand. The exploitation of African slaves and indigenous peoples in both Asia and Africa was a central component of the VOC's business model. The company's success depended not only on its superior maritime technology, but also on its ability to extract labor and resources from colonized populations. This exploitation created vast inequalities, both within the colonies themselves and between the Netherlands and the regions it controlled. The decline of the VOC and its legacy. The VOC's dominance of global trade reached its peak in the mid-17th century, but by the late 18th century, the company was in decline. A combination of factors contributed to its downfall, including increased competition from other European powers, such as the British East India Company, rising costs of military operations, and internal corruption. The company was also burdened by debt, as it had overextended itself in its efforts to maintain control over its vast empire. In 1799, after nearly 2 centuries of operation, the VOC was dissolved, and its assets were taken over by the Dutch government. However, the legacy of the VOC lived on. The Dutch continued to maintain control over many of the territories the VOC had established, particularly in Indonesia, where they would rule until the mid-20th century. The company's methods of exploitation, forced labor, and monopolistic control set a precedent for European colonialism in Asia and Africa. Asia. The VOC's impact on global trade and colonization was profound. By using its superior ships, navigation techniques, and military force, the company was able to dominate key trade routes and control the production of valuable goods. However, this dominance came at a significant human cost. The exploitation of indigenous peoples, the use of slave labor, and the violent suppression of resistance were central to the VOC's operations, creating deep and lasting inequalities in the regions it controlled. Conclusion. The Dutch East India Company was a pioneer in global trade and colonization, using its technological superiority to establish a vast empire that spanned Asia and Africa. Its success was built on the back of superior maritime technology, including advanced ships, navigation techniques, and military force. However, the VOC's legacy is also one of exploitation, coercion, and inequality. The company's monopolistic control over the spice trade and its use of forced labor created vast disparities in wealth and power, both within the Netherlands and in the colonies it dominated. The story of the VOC is a reminder that technological advancements, particularly in areas like transportation and warfare, can be used to exert control over distant lands and peoples. The unequal distribution of these technologies allowed the Dutch to build an empire that enriched the Netherlands at the expense of the colonies. Today, as we face the rise of new technologies like artificial intelligence,